What's the difference between the main character's wound and flaw?
They're interconnected. The wound and the flaw is interconnected. Something that I recognized the story was the flaw is the story of the wound. And with that recognition, I saw how strategy-wise a lot of stories are starting with the flaw in its shining glory. The value in starting with the flaw is that you are curious about the wound. You don't have the answer to what the wound is, but you are curious, why is the character the way they are? And then by the climax, we're getting a fuller view of the wound. So the difference is the wound is what happens to the character that creates the void. The flaw is how we see it come out, how the character is escaping the wound through distraction, through distracted behavior with the flaw.
Right, because if I think back to Emily the Criminal, she talked about living with her grandmother.
Yes.
So it hints that's
hints.
something she wasn't raised by her parents.
Yes.
So we knew
And you
something
feel the
was
void.
up. Right.
Yes.
So we don't totally know.
Yes.
But we're wondering, why did she have these series of events that happened? And then I think it doesn't come out right away. Mm-hmm. So it keeps you hooked.
It's the puzzle. Mm-hmm. And knowing how to strategize the puzzle is everything. And writers need to recognize that it's all a journey. The same thing like when you think about the transformation with falling in love, how when we first fall in love, we don't know enough about romantic love to know how to be, to know exactly what, and we're in this continuous learning process. And it is the same thing with the idea of this transformation where you don't just know what to do with story. You don't just know, oh, this is how I'm going to break it up and this is what the strategy is. The more that you study story, the more that you live story, the more that you feel story, your mind starts to see it in a depth that you never knew was possible until you get there.
And what's great is when you talk about falling in love, so many characters, I'm just thinking back to like Swingers or any Christmas movie where it's like someone's been jilted or
Yes.
they've been quote unquote abandoned, no one's calling.
Yes.
And in obsessing over that person, they then meet someone new.
Yes.
Who then later on it pays off where that abandoner calls and they don't need them anymore.
Exactly
so it's
right. That's exactly right. It is all in the transformation. And when we look at our life, and like in my own personal arc, I look at when I went through two defining moments that sold my book, Storyline, Finding Gold in Your Life Story, and Change Your Story, Change Your Life. It had to do with a long relationship that ended in a short marriage early on in life, and then a career trajectory that was interrupted. And in looking at if those two moments hadn't happened, I wouldn't have found what I view as the love of my life for the last 9 years. I wouldn't have met him unless those two negative things happened in my life. So I think the object of story is to teach people when bad things happen, there is a greater purpose as it links to the healing of the earlier wound and as it links to the overall growth in the life process. And because so many of us in life, when we're in the heat of our all is lost moments, aren't ready for that awareness, story is continuously making us conscious of that awareness.
And do you think that in a good story, that all is lost moment has to then resurface later on down the line once things are quote unquote better for the character to really test them?
I don't think always. I think it works tremendously if it's done well. I think always would make story too formulaic and too predictable. So I think if it's done in a creative way where we see the dilemma in a different light, now that the character has done the emotional work through the action, obstacle, stake sequence, and at the climax, you're at a place of did they or didn't they come into the transformation through the recognition of the flaw, then yes. So looking at that.
Does every protagonist need a goal?
Absolutely. If there's one thing in story you just nailed, the most important thing in story. The goal is everything. The external goal as well as the internal goal. The understanding of the want versus the need, and the recognition that often the character wants something externally that isn't in the transformed thinking of the mindset things that we talked about with the idea of survival mindset, intuitive mindset, and intellectual mindset. So the goal is if you don't know what the character wants, the story doesn't work. And knowing that, is the character going to get what they want externally, or are they going to get it internally, is what keeps the audience interested in the story.
Do you ever say to writers, I feel like the goal for your character, the stakes need to be risen. It's not important enough, but it doesn't seem like it would be sensible for most people.
All the time. Stakes is something, the dream is an aha moment that I had in my study of story. When you set the dream up at the beginning, the dream sets up the stakes. When we know what the character wants and why they want it through the dream, then we get a glimpse of the internal and the external stakes. So the dream is a pivotal tool in the setup that can make all the difference in the world with feeling the stakes.
So is that something that you see sometimes with new writers, that their goal, it's too small of a goal, you need to really up the ante?
Yes, and that goes into the idea of what a question I ask all the time is, what is the worst that can happen if the goal is not achieved? And that means that if the answer is they could, miss going on a date, or they could something so small that in the bigger scheme of things doesn't feel like a life and death type of scenario, then it's not working.
Do you ever recommend people do a Q&A with their character?
Yes, I do. In story therapy. That's interesting you asked that question. Excellent question. In story therapy, I have a whole set of questions that I give writers that is the idea of understanding the character's awareness of what's holding them back, of what happened in the past, of what do they want, and getting to know your character by having this type of interview with your character.
And then too, it seems like then the characters would really come out more if you're doing this interview
Yes.
with your character. It seems like almost it would become more and more real to you.
Oh yeah, I think the writer knowing the character and feeling the character from the inside is so important with how the audience is going to experience the character. Something I recognize that a lot of writers do is they give the wound to the wrong character. So we'll end up knowing more about a supporting character than we will about the central character. And when that happens, then we're going, what do we know about the central character? Why don't we feel the same type of pull? And we start to go, why isn't it the other character's story? Since the other character has more to lose with the stakes because we know their wound. Another thing that I'm seeing a lot of stories do, which is fantastic, is they are developing the wound for the antagonist in more depth than they have. And as long as the protagonist, we feel their wound at a high level, and you parallel, so you have a strategy with the wound of the antagonist, then it can work really well.
Is there a danger in the writer identifying too much with the protagonist because it's like too precious to them? If the lines are blurred and it's like, well, essentially this is really me.
Yes.
Is there a danger in that?
Yes, because of exactly what you might think. When the character is too much like them and they feel like, I wouldn't do that, yet dramatically it doesn't work in the story. And that has to do with like writers who are telling story from an autobiographical angle versus an angle of emotional truth. When they're telling a story from an autobiographical angle, they get stuck on the idea of, well, that didn't happen. Well, that didn't happen, without recognizing that life doesn't happen in dramatic structure.